Wow.
Oh, wow.
Is that clock right or is that slow?
I have no idea.
Oh, clock's a little bit slow. Yeah, it's 9:45.
Okay.
Well, it will be in 10 seconds.
All right, second installment on the return of prodigals by Henri Nouwen. Thanks for coming. Do you have our picture? Whoever brought it up? You know, the original picture, I think, is 6x8. Huge thing. So if you felt sort of like, why didn't I see all those other little figures in here before? It's because it's so tiny. Can't see them. Let's have a word of prayer. Gracious God, thanks for bringing us together this wonderful Sunday gathering of your people. And I just pray as we meditate on this book and thoughts in it, that we'd be awakened to some spiritual truth. In Jesus' name, amen. So, just curious, have you formed a picture in your mind of Henri Nouwen yet? Maybe at first I should ask, have any of you ever seen him, or nobody's ever seen him? All right, so I'm just curious, what's he look like? This guy who's writing this book to us here.
What's he look like?
Yeah, don't you have a little picture in your head? or describe him somehow?
I have a picture of him, but it's not a picture of him. I think he's very insecure, very troubled. I think that he probably had psychiatric problems. And I'm talking about his favorite writer. But he's very straightforward, and he says things that I wish that I had known and said before. He's me.
I agree that it's so interesting just to think like, because I don't like to write or I don't think this deeply. So just the fact that is what he's also sharing so deeply in this book. I think it's impressive. So you get more of a inner picture of his inside as opposed to his outside.
Do you have a different picture, Stan?
No, that is my picture of him, not quite as stark as hers, but that he is a person who has shared a lot of himself in the books, but not all of his books. I think I counted my books of Nouwen's. I have 37 of them. So a lot of those he doesn't share himself. Toward the end of his writings, he begins to share more of himself.
I mean, his later books.
Yeah.
Where does this fall?
This one,
This is toward the end.
yeah.
When I've seen him on YouTube on
Oh,
old
okay.
things, and he's kind of skinny and curly haired and very, very passionate. Very animated,
Okay.
very, trying to connect.
Okay, he's not just folding his hands. Like a priest, okay. The word that came to me, just from this guy must be earnest. Earnest was the term that came to me. So
The person,
yeah, the
the
person.
movie guy?
Oh, Henry.
G-A-R-N.
Ernest saves Halloween.
I mean, it's neither here nor.
It's the way you said it, I'm sorry.
The
What?
problem of being earnest or whatever that was, yeah. No, I was just curious. He does speak from himself, obviously. It's very conversational when you say, seems to me, and
really wants to know the truth, but doesn't want to let go of the control. He likes being in control.
Yeah, my adjective would be conflicted. He's very conflicted, yeah, in different ways, yeah.
does that change the way you read it at all, or the truth of what he says? Okay, all right, good. So truth comes in a lot of different bodies, that's. Okay. Well, there's just a curiosity on my part. I don't know what your book looks like, but I got a lot of underlining in mine. And, you know, as we go through this, I'm just kind of, we're gonna go through it chapter by chapter a little bit. And I will miss probably some of your favorite underlinings, so I'm going to invite you to make sure those get brought up in the course of our discussion this morning. And, you know, we'll just kind of talk about it. It's kind of backing off from it. Seems like the introduction and that first chapter have a lot to do with process. You know, he identifies certain, well, in Rembrandt's life and in the painting, he kind of sees some phases of his life that Nouwen identifies with. And then in that first chapter, I don't know quite how to say this, but it's I wouldn't call it faith development in a classic sense that we think about faith development, I guess. Certainly, when he talks about interiority and inner light, it's kind of an interesting phrase. It's sort of maybe an end state of the impact of faith on our personhood. Maybe that's a way to say it. I'm not sure. And then that second chapter really gets into sort of the nature of rebellion and our problem of getting back to God in a way. So kind of with that little framework in mind, maybe we could just jump into this. I mean, the parable and the book pick up on one of the primary themes of the Bible, I think, don't you? Rebellion and reconciliation. And Peter might be one that comes to mind, one maybe that didn't come out so good. Cain might be another one. But certainly a theme that repeats itself in the scripture. So if you got your little cheat sheet here, maybe we can just begin. And again, if I didn't get your underline, make sure you put it up here. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about, have there been, I'm looking at kind of the age in here, have there been, there's enough life lived that certainly as you look back on your life, you might see a pattern to the way, you know, your Christian faith is unfolded, or that critical incidences or people perhaps that have sort of been critical to progression in your own journey toward God. Can you reflect on that at all? Kind of see where you're at here. Maybe if you see something like a stage or a phase, you know, where would you be now?
You might go through all those stages in one day, you know, more than once. I mean, you could,
Yeah.
sometimes you're feeling like the son and very needy, and other times you're jealous, other times you're more like the father. I mean, I think you could see it that way too. Maybe you land on one that kind of reflects your life right now, but I think we all have these insecurities and.
So that pattern sort of spoke to you
A little bit.
a little bit. What would you add to it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think I have become, over the last 20 or 30 years, much more contemplative in nature and in practice than I was in my early years, by far.
Is that just a function of old age, you think? Well, that was very nice. Was that a function of maturity?
I'm very part of old age.
He's old.
Yeah, you are older than I am.
You would know, Wayne.
I've heard.
I think it's partly though of learning. I think I've done more reading of contemplative authors in the last 20 or 30 years than I did before at all. You know, that was not something I ever read before.
Interesting that at this point in your life, that becomes more interesting.
Mhm.
Other thoughts? Where are you all? Right here.
I was interested that now in the first chapter, really talked more about Rembrandt
Mhm.
Yeah.
than about the prodigal son, about the son at all. He talked about the age and the sensitivity of Rembrandt as he came down off his high horse.
So he sees kind of a pattern in Rembrandt's life that maybe mirrors
Yeah.
the pattern. in
He was
Prodigal
continuing
Son.
his thoughts, I think, in the first introductory chapter.
Well, that was his way into this whole thing, I think. And it was, did you find it interesting too, that earlier Rembrandt's paintings didn't have some of the qualities that his later ones did? And he was, yeah.
You wonder if there was something else happened in Rembrandt's life at a later age that. Well, one, I think it was interesting, both Rembrandt and Nouwen both chose to write, Nouwen to talk about Rembrandt. In their later life. In the Prodigal Son, you would expect Nouwen in a way to talk more about this early in his life. I mean, it's sort of one of his life to, I don't have an answer for it, but. And maybe it's like you were describing, maybe become more contemplative
Mhm.
as you live, years go by,
Didn't he
Prodigal-
didn't he have another painting of the prodigal son that he'd done 20
Yeah, it
years?
was a sketch, I think.
A sketch.
It
Yeah.
shows it in here.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think his comment about that was there was a lot more action.
Yeah,
Not as much kind of stillness.
so he had thought about it,
Yeah,
but he was at a different place.
Yeah.
At this point in his life.
okay.
By the way, throw a plug in, there's a book maybe some of you heard of by Richard Rohr, Falling Upward.
Yeah.
About kind of the two halves of life, and it makes me think about, the younger, you're
Yeah.
probably, I have a lot of old books on like, church growth and those kinds of things, or, along that line, administrative kinds of things, and then, more contemplative, as I get, yeah.
His struggle with vocation, or the aspect of vocation he brings into it.
Now,
So now,
yeah,
where he leaves Harvard and is willing to go to work at large in, France and ultimately Canada, but it's that whole idea he wants to discern the call. And yeah, in my own life, I think it's led me to work with vulnerable people that, because I am one, I see myself as the prodigal in the picture, and just the need to reach out and touch people that are broken. And I think he has a real heartfelt sense of care to do that, for him to go from, and he mentions that, to go from being in control, teaching university students, having all the answers, being able to, discern a debate or give answers, and then to go into that situation where people are really vulnerable and don't have a high IQ and, can't do reasoned debates. So it speaks a lot of him to want to even be in that setting, and makes me want to, am I okay with that? In my own life around people.
I did find it interesting that his professional career, he kind of identifies as the far country. In retrospect. That's part of what he talks about later, not being able to hear the voice of God, because you're wrapped up in too many other things. So Paul, who
Yeah.
teaches developmental psych,
Yes,
there's a comment here for you, I think.
yes.
Response to Ben's feeling like now he wants to. Is he odd in thinking
No.
that way?
So everything you guys have been talking about lines up really, so within lifespan psychology. Because we refer to it as lifespan now because developmental psych usually just focus on kids. There is a whole host of different theories that we use. The one that I find the most valuable was proposed by Eric Erickson. It's the idea of the psychosocial stages of development, where you experience a major life crisis at each stage. And the psychoanalytic framework is really out of date. We're more cognitive in the way that we think about things, but I still find value in Erickson's view of things, especially because there's more evidence supporting the different crises as you get older, especially what we sort of think of as the generativity versus stagnation crisis, which a lot of adults are in, where they're trying to figure out, how do I give back to the world? Or am I not giving back into the world in some way? Giving back by either having kids or contributing to society is generativity. Stagnation is just sort of taking from things and not really contributing anything back. But when we look at someone who gets to a later stage in life and you find yourself more yeah, and I'm trying to be polite, but you said it. So when you get to a later stage in life, you move into the ego, integrity versus despair stage. And in that stage, when we see this, not just in Erickson's evidence or framework, but also when we look at the cognition of older adults, when they get to later stages in their lives, there's this thing called reminiscence that happens, where you spend more time reflecting on your life, trying to understand or find narrative threads that show changes or transitions that you've gone through. So reflection, contemplation, trying to look at the whole instead of just looking at individual parts of your life. Those are all really common things for older adults. And that would be what Erickson would refer to as the ego integrity or ego identity portion of the crisis, where you try to find meaning in your life as you get older. You try to think, what are the major lessons that I've learned? Am I wiser than I used to be? Have I changed? Has my life made an impact on others? Versus the despair end of things, where you kind of go, well, I didn't learn anything. That was pointless. And you just kind of embrace the pointlessness of life if you're landing on the despair side of things. So if you're looking at anybody's lifespan, you can actually see the fingerprints of each of those steps popping up. And it sounds like he's very much in. If you saw a change in him and he started sharing more about his life later on in his later writings, and we see a change in Rembrandt's paintings where he's concentrating more on stillness and interiority and reflection in his later works, those suggest that they've moved into the ego integrity versus despair crisis. Does that help at all what you wanted, William?
That was it.
All right. Handy to have a psychologist do that.
It really is. I mean, I've studied Erickson, but it was 45 million years ago.
No, I just lectured about him on Friday.
I knew you would hit it a little bit. Much more succinctly.
You know, to counter that, and I was surprised that there was a book that was written when I was growing up and in the stage, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. And that book had, to me, a meaning which I had not discovered before of life and care. And, you know, because at that age, you know, in the early 20s, late teens, it was all about you. And then all of a sudden you read Gibran's book, and that prophet just changed my outlook on many things. I lost it middle age, I think, more, and then going back to it, which is really sort of interesting. So I mean, that's sort of somewhat counter to what you were talking about.
Not really, it actually fits in perfectly with Eric's stages.
Yeah.
So if you're focused more on yourself in your adolescence, that's called the identity crisis. And that's exactly what people do when they're teens, is they try to wrestle with who they are and they're very self-focused. Then when you transition to the generativity stagnation crisis, Yeah, and there's this thing called the intimacy versus isolation crisis, which follows right after the identity crisis, where you're trying to connect with other people, and then you begin to contemplate your own life. There are no firm borders with any of those things, and many of them can over. The world and how you're fitting in with God's church a little bit more, that suggests that you might kind of move into that generativity and stagnation crisis a little bit early. Yeah, so it very much fits very nicely with Erickson's framework.
Thanks.
Sure.
So I wanna, picking up on the threads of Nouwen's life here, and he talks about becoming in his latter stage or phase about becoming a father figure, which as he moves into daybreak, right? And he wanted to, and he was challenged to claim for himself, and here's the phrase, the authority of compassion. Somebody talk to me about that. He's later in life, he's reflecting. He wants to give back. He's probably in some sort of generativity mode. He's had kind of a crisis, which sort of pushed him in there. He had to counter with a friend, right? The authority of compassion. That kind of echoes as we read Elon Musk saying the problem with Western civilization, is empathy, the weakness in Westerns. And then I read, the authority of compassion. Interesting. Anyway, help me out here. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring that other thing in. This is church.
Oh, that's fine.
Anybody feel the authority of compassion? I mean, what do you think that means? And I'm not saying that this is a stage or that you all kind of come to this sort of insight, but what do you think it meant for Nouwen? And does it have any kind of connection
Yeah, I mean,
to your living out your life of faith? The authority of compassion.
I mean, there are a couple ways that I see that right now, where I see authority figures without compassion, who are eroding their own power, but due to their lack of compassion. But also, I heard somebody say this recently, that very often the smartest person in the room is also the kindest. And I thought a lot about that, where in order to have or cultivate compassion and to cultivate kindness, you really do have to think about what other people are going through to make a connection with them, to try to see the world through their eyes. And that does a lot of work sort of dismantling our callousness and our cruelty. And I think that when you see someone show genuine compassion, genuine kindness, genuine love to someone else, there's a gravity about that. There's a weight to it, and it's an attractive thing. It draws you to that person. So in some ways, when you are acting compassionately, at least to certain people, maybe not to Elon Musk, that becomes an attractive thing, and it results in that person having some kind of authority where you want to hear what they have to say. Because I think that we all crave kindness on some level.
I wonder when Jesus's hearers would often comment, he speaks with authority, if they were perhaps sensing the authority of compassion. That's part of that. Pam,
Well, I
in the
think-
back, speak.
Yes, I think sometimes, when I help the homeless at Taffy,
Mhm.
they've known me for years, and like when I'm trying to tell them that I think they're doing something wrong, either drugs or, no, you don't treat people like that. They listen to me sometimes because they know it's coming from compassion. Why should I listen to you? Well, because you care about me, okay. And because other people can say the same message that they don't know very well or something like that, and they ignore them. But sometimes I feel like they listen to me a little bit because I've got a history with them, they know me, and they know that I'm really only thinking of their best interest. You really shouldn't do that, Well, who are you to tell me? I very rarely have people say that to me.
Mhm.
And maybe it's because it's the authority of compassion, they know I'm compassionate toward them.
Right.
Because I hear them talking to others like, you can't tell me what to do, or, why should you say that? But very rarely do they come back with that phrase to me.
So it has to do with the authenticity
Yes.
of the compassion, the
Yes.
authority. Becomes authority because they're authentic.
And you can see the reverse, because you see people that understandably, generation to generation, things change. And there are certain people that when they get to a certain point in their lives, look back and start telling the younger generation that they're terrible and that they don't know what they're doing. And so those people won't hold any authority for those people, because they're like, well, screw you, you don't know me, right? So the people who actually make the effort to connect and get to know them carry weight, even if their generation's different from those other people.
So I don't know if it's linked or not, but maybe a part of this authority of compassion, he also refers to something called the development of inner light and interiority. Any thoughts about that? What do you think he means by those terms? Is that different from perhaps what we just talked about, or is that extended somehow?
I think Nouwen himself describes it
Okay.
pretty
read to
well
us.
on
Yeah.
page 16. He says, however, he's talking about daybreak, he says, I have been led to an inner place where I had never been before. It is the place within me where God has chosen to dwell. It is the place where I am held in the embrace of an all-loving Father, who calls me by name and says, you are my beloved son, and on you my favorite rest. It is the place where I can taste joy and peace. And that is not of this world. The place had always been there, I'd always been aware of it as the source of all grace, but I had not been able to enter it and truly live there. Interesting.
And somehow, apparently this space, this occupied space by God, if you will, in our lives, has an outward radiant sort of almost physical presence to it. He's suggesting by interiority that is luminescent. That just is kind of intrigues me. I don't know. I look in the mirror, I don't look too radiant. Maybe that's just the morning, I'm not sure. You all look pretty good though right now.
And sometimes the words that came to me were when you can intellectualize things as opposed to truly whatever the opposite that is somewhat what the passage you read
Okay.
feels like a bit.
Apparently it's seeable, interesting. Can be sealed. To the eye. Any other thoughts there before we move on?
Well, where Matt wants to go on your trip to Scotland, Iona, I've done some reading on, and it's known as a thin place. A place where the separation between just meeting with God and being in his presence is so thin that you're like there. And to me, I've had times where just, in prayer and meditation, just like Stan, I feel like my last few years have become more involved in contemplation and the reality of that. And there is an old Scottish saying that some things are better felt than told, and you feel God and feel his presence. I mean, that's such a wonderful thing to do. And that's a reality in my own life, I feel.
Good. You're gonna say something. You weren't gonna say something.
In the first paragraph of chapter 1, Nouwen says, the perception in which physical blindness and a deep inner seeing are intimately connected. Jesus often talked about healing the blind, but how oftentimes the Pharisees could see still were blind. That somehow there's a connection between blindness and still seeing interiorly.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I wrote a whole paper on that from King Lear about how the blind really were the ones who saw it. Yeah, oh my gosh, back in the day, yeah.
That's all you're gonna tell us?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was the blind man that really had the
Okay,
sight,
good,
the
right, the sight.
seeing
Yeah.
didn't really truly see, yeah.
Good. Okay, so now we sort of leave this end state of interiority, inner light, the authority of compassion, the kind of thing that happens as we progress through life, in the life of faith, all right, to the problem of the prodigal who left all that, okay, so chapter 2, the younger son leaves. Now, have I missed any other underlines here in the first 2 chapters? Get too far ahead here. So I'm listening to KNOP in the morning, which I do occasionally. And as every morning, a while their auto sponsors focus on the family's little blurb, right? And there's a little thought for the day. And the guy was talking about parents and kids and rebellion, and he said this, since we're talking about rebellion. Rules without relationship results in rebellion. Kind of snappy, isn't it?
But
What do you
it's
think
true.
about that?
Mhm.
Oh, we have truth over here, okay. Oh, we have a nod, rules without relationship.
I mean,
Results
as
in-
someone who works with students all the time, they are much more likely to follow rules if they have a relationship with you. Much more.
I would add time to
Mhm.
that equation.
Yeah,
So it takes a while to build relationships and develop that authority we were just talking about.
The authority of compassion, no, it's not the hammer. You like that, okay, is
I
that,
don't like
is that?
focus on the family that much, but that was a catchy.
What? I mean, is there anything else, any other dynamic related to rebellion that we ought to be thinking about, or is this it?
Age, maybe.
Hormones?
yeah.
And if, I would say it's not automatic too.
Yeah.
There's, you know,
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that. Too. Okay. What about the prodigal? You have a bad relationship with his dad, we don't really know anything about that, I wonder how that fits in at all.
Maybe his dad instilled in him a desire to search that out, search something out that he doesn't discover at home.
Well-
And that's good.
Yeah, you just jumped to the last paragraph.
Oh, I'm sorry.
of Chapter 2. That's all right, no, that's quite all right. Yeah, all right. Yeah, I've been kind of mulling around that in my head. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. Sometimes, you know, Adam and Eve, they had a pretty good relationship, didn't they, with God? So, I mean, sometimes a relationship doesn't seem to work either, so I don't know. But it's probably not a bad rule of thumb, I guess, too. He does make the point, though, that the biblical context for rebellion in this story is more than just simply disrespect. It's a betrayal of the treasured values of family and community. The distant country is the world in which everything considered holy at home is disregarded. So I'm kind of wondering even how Nouwen saw himself as a prodigal son in this whole story. It was kind of interesting. How does his understanding about the distant land kind of impact your own rebellion? If you've rebelled.
Well, here, I mean, on 37, leaving home is living as though I do not yet have a home. And must look further and wider to find it.
Read that again.
Leaving home is living as though I do not yet have a home.
Not recognizing it.
And must look further and wide to find one.
Nouwen was always looking for a home. And that was part of who he was all of his life.
in a spiritual sense,
I think in a literal sense,
In a literal
in a
sense.
very, that's why, Toronto and Larch, they accepted him just as he was. And that's what he was always looking for. Always.
Which is tied to sort of the phrase of conversing with someone who you do not know. They see you as you are,
Mhm.
not as they think you should be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what he was looking for.
That's
Always.
I don't know who said that, that's a nursing phrase.
so his identification with being a prodigal is the fact that he doesn't have a home. Or he
That
doesn't
he
recognize a
felt-
home.
He felt as if he had to prove himself to others. By being smarter, richer, whatever. Recognized. And once you start proving yourself to others, you're never at home.
He gave the example of the girl that came and gave him a hug.
Mm.
That was such an by surprise and
Mhm.
contradicting that thought.
Mhm.
And what does he identify as our spiritual home? The word.
Are you looking at me?
You are the beloved. That was
Yeah.
beloved.
Our lack of ability to accept or believe in the fact that we are beloved.
Beloved, yeah.
What do you think of that? By God.
He talks about the hands on the sons, the big hands that are illuminated. And the son's head on the father's breast, you know. It's that acceptance.
Does that image help you understand belovedness? I mean, this is a big deal for him.
And then towards the end of chapter 2, it seems to me now that these hands have always been stretched out, even when there were no shoulders upon which to rest them. God has never pulled back his arms, never withheld his blessing, never stopped considering his son the beloved one.
Amen.
So what's our problem? We kind of. We don't see it. Huh?
What is our problem?
We're people.
What is our problem
What is your problem?
Well,
today? This moment?
Well, I mean, is he saying something kind of universal here? That we just somehow, for whatever reason, fail to recognize our status before God? Is that kind of what he's saying? Or our lack of acceptance of that status?
Or our rebellion against that status. I think it's all of that.
Or believing ourselves undeserving of this
Yeah,
status
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, that's why it's a mishmash of everything.
I think he's also calling us to provide that status to others.
And can we, without recognizing it in ourselves, in our relationship with God? I mean, can we do that apart from our relationship from God? Do you think? Or is any expressed belovedness to others always a reflection of that status we have with God, whether we recognize it or not?
I just think it can get really complicated because there are also people who co-opt the position of the father.
Yeah,
There's parts of the church that co-opt the position of the father.
Yeah.
And so those people who have been driven away, it's a really complex situation because when they look at what coming back would look like, how do you see it as a separate thing or is it so embedded? I guess in some of our background in church have heard the prodigal son story used as like you need to get back in line, right? Kind of a thing, and not, it was very much like an authority legalism type thing. And so for some people, they've been raised in that, and that's how, I don't know, it's complicated. Like, then how do you feel beloved when you see the father is not
Very
who God
loving,
is?
not very loving.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And he makes some assertions about the nature of belovedness. He says this turns, where is this on page 39? I think we probably ought to read this, because this is what we're leaving. Or this is what we don't ever understand, maybe. This is maybe what factions of our upbringing have kind of obliterated, I don't know. But toward the top there, a few lines down, we start as the beloved of my heavenly Father, here it goes. I can walk in the valley of darkness, no evil would I fear. As the beloved, I can cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out devils. Having received without charge, I can give without charge. As the beloved, I can confront, console, admonish, encourage without fear of rejection or need of affirmation. As the beloved, I can suffer persecution without desire for revenge and receive praise without using it as proof of my goodness. As the beloved, I can be tortured and killed without ever having to doubt that the love that is given to me is stronger than death. As the beloved, I am free to live and give life, free also to die while giving life. That's pretty potent.
He writes that, but he doesn't really believe that at this point. Down farther, he says, somehow I have become deaf to the voice that calls me the beloved.
So the problem of recognizing we're beloved, he says, is at least twofold. You might think of a few other. One is that God's voice is kind of subtle. Speaking
Or it's
about the
for
Elijah
other
thing,
people.
or that it's drowned out by every other voice that oppresses us, I guess, in a sense. From the media to the family, to the church, to the whatever. Yeah. What do you think of that? Do we have a valid excuse?
I heard a preacher once say the only problem with life is that it's just so daily.
That's awesome.
You know, and maybe that's part of
Just so daily, every day.
I mean, so how about it? Is God's voice too subtle? We just kind of had a 3-session deal here about listening to God. We all struggle with it. We're not quite sure what we're talking about sometimes when we say God's talking to us. It's hard to articulate what that means, what that looks like or feels like, or whatever it is, whether it's up here or down here or wherever that voice is coming from. And I know, as soon as I'm sitting here, there's plenty of other voices that are kind of jamming the signal.
I think a lot of life teaches us in society that love is conditional. And it's really hard to,
Those are the voices, aren't they?
yeah, those
Yeah.
voices, to understand the unconditional love
Yeah.
of God. It just, and it seems like that's what he struggles with, as we all do.
Yeah, yeah, okay, legit. So what does this look like for you? To kind of on through that. Or is it up to you? Or does God just sort of break through periodically and remind you of something? Communication is two-way.
I think, it's more often the case that it has to do with our framework, our perception, and, our abilities that, referencing the idea of whether God's voice is too subtle. I think that, maybe maybe it's the little tiny Calvinist in me or whatever, right? That, you know, it's like it kind of puts it back on our frailty and things, but that, you know, I mean, there are things that Jesus teaches about, you know, loving our enemies and praying for them and so on, and it's pretty clear. Why is that? But, you know, and yet, why, you know, why do we struggle, you know, with those things? I mean, so, you know, could God be more clear?
Yeah.
Than some of the things that we see. And yet, you know, like we've been talking about Israel, Palestine, you know, and you know, the apartheid state. And it's like, that's not subtle, but we're wring our hands over it. You know, we can't free Palestinians because of this or that or whatever. And I mean, all these different things, you know, and it's like, people are suffering, dying.
That whole discussion kind of leads into what he calls the fragility of our faith. I guess all these interrupting or contaminating voices in our life. Did you identify with that at all? Does your faith feel, you know, we are always saying, as we grow in Christ likeness, as we in our journey toward God, we're developing a stronger faith and a stronger faith. And interesting, he just, pretty fragile. Does that resonate with you?
It resonates with me. Yeah. I think I have a weaker faith now than I did when I was younger.
A weaker faith with all that contemplation, Stan?
Yeah. I think I have more questions and more doubts and more
Is that,
struggles than,
is that a weaker
But that's
faith?
not a weaker faith.
I don't know what it is.
Maybe that's
I
a
don't-
winnowing faith.
Yeah, I have no idea what you might want to call it, but it just feels like I have a weaker faith now than I did before.
Orthodox theology is getting deconstructed, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe so.
On page 39, he says, faith is the radical trust that home has always been there and always will be there. How many of us can say that we believe that 100% of the time?
You have to have experienced home somehow.
Yes, yeah, but then you fall away and come back and fall away and come back, and you know, it's this repeated thing.
And is that falling away and coming back, that sort of cycle of prodigality, is that a word? Yeah. That maybe speaks to the fragility of faith.
I think it's all part of just daily growth, renewal, acceptance, and then you go through it all again. Richard Rohr has a saying about the journey. He says, a good journey begins with knowing where we are, but willing to go somewhere else. You know, and I think that's the constant daily thing of growth and renewal, change, and plus we're constantly just going through those things, you know, kind of like Jacob wrestled with the angel. He wouldn't let him go until he received a blessing, you know, and then the angel had to grab him in the hip and wound him. In a sense, we're all, in another book, wounded healers, you know, to quote now on the phrase. And we all need to be wounded in a way and to know it so that we can go out and touch other people who have, like Pam was saying, working with people who, once we've been there, then we can touch them in that same place.
The point of connection.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the way he talks about rebellion is not the way we usually think about rebellion. And it was actually kind of helpful to me. If I can read this little passage on 43. This is what I said, just in case you don't think we rebelled. He says, I'm a prodigal son every time I search for unconditional love where it cannot be found. Why do I keep ignoring the place of true love and persist in looking for it elsewhere? Why do I keep leaving home where I am called a child of God, the beloved of my Father? I am constantly surprised at how I keep taking the gifts God has given me, health, my intellectual and emotional gifts, and keep using them to impress people, receive affirmation and praise, and compete for rewards instead of developing them for the glory of God. Yes, I often carry them off to a distant country and I put them in the service of an exploiting world that does not know their true value. It's almost as if I want to prove to myself and to my world that I do not need God's love, that I can make a life on my own, that I want to be fully independent. Beneath it all is the great rebellion, the radical no to the Father's love, the unspoken curse, I wish you were dead. The prodigal son's no reflects Adam's original rebellion, his rejection of the God in whose love we are created and by whose love we are sustained. It is a rebellion that places me outside the garden, out of reach of the tree of life. It is a rebellion that makes me dissipate myself in a distant country. This is all pretty depressing.
But I think it's also true. For many of us anyway.
Yeah, I mean, can you repeat Isaiah 53:6? All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord hath on every iniquity of us all. Which is a nice segue into next week where he talks about Jesus as the prodigal son. So if you're ready to be blown away by that. Yeah. So we're prodigals.
Martin Luther, one of my fathers, said at his deathbed, I am only a beggar. And I think that's in some ways true for all of us. We're simply beggars.
So is there any gospel in these couple of chapters amidst all this sort of
I think there is.
brutal
I think-
reality that we face as Christians?
For me, I think God is always saying we're beloved, no matter
Okay.
whether we turn our back or not. He
There's a little
keeps saying
gospel.
we're his beloved.
Amen.
If,
Yeah.
No, if,
it's always an if.
no,
What's that?
no if.
Speak to us of ifs.
If you don't sin, if you follow the 10 Commandments, if. It drives me absolutely crazy.
You're still beloved.
No, I'm not.
You're trying to be the elder brother.
Pardon me?
You're trying to be the elder brother.
I'm reading the Bible.
Well, the sun is still shining, even though there's a cloud there, it's still, and like Port Angeles, it'll come out today a few times. We just have to know it's always there, right? Like Stan's saying, it's,
Yeah, but isn't the pearly gates if?
But is the pearly gates in the Bible?
Clarify. Can you clarify that?
Well, I mean, the question is your name in the book?
There's an old man.
Or is mine?
And that's the if side.
But that doesn't mean you're not loved. I mean,
Right.
my children, in a variety of times of their life, have, rejected my love and gone their own way and not spoke to me for a couple of years, and doesn't mean I ever stopped loving them. I love them, even if they were out there. It wasn't that I will only love you if you come back, or I only love you. Now they have come back, so to speak, and we have a great relationship with both my daughters, but there were a time when they wasn't, but there was never a time when I did not love them. I mean, there were a time I didn't like them so much, I didn't like what they were doing and all that sort of stuff, but, they were always beloved. They were always beloved to me, and if I can be loving to my wayward daughters, think what much more God can love us in our waywardness. I mean, I'm just a human. He is, sovereign, and so, I mean, I think that no matter what we do, I don't think God is waiting for us to say, I only love you if. I will love you always, no matter what you do. I mean, as an imperfect parent, I always love my children. And,
He, Nouwen does add a little dimension to I guess, the gospel of love. It's not only that God, or that we are beloved of God, but he makes this comment. He says, it was love that prevented the father from keeping his son at all costs. It was love that allowed the father to let his son find his own life, even with the risk of losing it. It's an odd love, isn't it? It was, I mean, that's exactly the situation with Adam and Eve, though, isn't it? Yeah. So here is the mystery of my life is unveiled. I am loved so much that I am left free to leave home. The blessing is there from the beginning. I have left it and keep on leaving it. But the Father is always looking for me with outstretched arms to receive me back and whisper again in my ear, "You're beloved, I do my favorite best." I kind of check that as the gospel chapters here. You good with that? I mean, we can't leave with all this failure.
Well, until the father runs out of the blessed sheep, the roast. What if he runs out of the sheep?
Maybe that's good.
How long?
What do you mean it runs out of sheep?
Well, the fatted calf, you know, if he runs out of the fatted calf,
Oh,
you know, okay, I've run through 12 of them, damn it. You know, I'm tired of it.
Then the phrase God is love doesn't make any sense. All right, we're a little bit early to go for agenda. The next chapter,
Just one.
Just three.
Just three.
Just three.
That's my understanding. The return. You know,
Yeah, because that's the
Why-
last part.
here's the question to think about. Why amidst all this travel to the far country, and you think about your own rebellion, why did the prodigal return? You know, sometimes hard times provoke a change in a positive direction, sometimes hard times doesn't, you know. So this is the great black box in our personhood. How's that, where is that switch and how does it get turned off and on? There's the big question for next week. How does God flip it? All right, so let's have a little prayer. Actually, I wrote out a little prayer. I'll just read it. Dear Lord, I pray that your belovedness would permeate our lives this week. Forgive our inclination to substitute the lure of the distant country and our own desires for independence for the embrace of your unconditional love. Quiet our hearts and lives to hear your voice and fill us with your luminous light for your kingdom's sake. Thank you.
thank you, Wayne. That's good.
Find it,